Whiskey is in the rye of the beholder. No. Rye for a rye? No. Rye hard with a vengeance. Get rich or rye trying. 1,000 ways to rye in the West. The rye versus rye.
Did you get it out of your system?
Yeah, I think so. Today I'm reviewing 2 rye whiskies from Archie Distillery. There's the 2018 Single Paddock Whisky Harvest and the 2019 Dry Grown Rye Malt. Hey guys, I'm Nath Martyn, the Whisky Scribe. I'm a whisky enthusiast and I love all things whisky, but taste is subjective and there's a lot of whiskies out there. So whether you consider yourself a connoisseur or you're just looking to understand more about whiskey, let's explore it together. If you want to see more from me, consider subscribing. I put up new videos every week. You can also follow me over on Instagram. There are only a handful of whisky distilleries within the city of Sydney. Now, I've already visited Manly Spirits Co, where they make Coastal Stone whiskey. You can actually see that tour here. But the oldest of the whisky distilleries in Sydney is Archie Rose. They're just a few kilometres south of the city centre. They opened their doors in 2014 with a dry gin, a vodka and a white rye, but they've been laying down whisky right from the start, and they released their first whisky in 2019. They're nothing short of a dynamic distillery. They've won awards for their whiskies as well as their gins, vodkas and their rums. They switched up production during COVID to make hand sanitizer, and earlier this year for Pride Week, they collaborated with another brand and created their own personal lubricant. Do with that what you will, but let's get back to the whiskey. While many distilleries will primarily make one whiskey base, like a single malt, and then age that in many different ways, Archie Rose actually make both single malt and rye whiskey, and they play around with a lot of the different grain mixes, which is what brings me to this week's whiskey. So I have 2 rye whiskies today for a bit of rye versus rye. So the first is the Archie Rose Single Paddock Whisky Harvest of 2018, which pays tribute to the hardiness of a single paddock of heritage rye. So 2018 isn't actually a release date, it's the year that the rye was grown, and it was actually grown in the middle of a pretty bad drought in New South Wales. So it was under pretty poor conditions with absolutely no irrigation. And then it was allowed to wild ferment a bit before malting. Now the second whiskey I have today was actually only released a couple of weeks ago, and I was lucky enough to be at the first tasting on the day of its release day, which is how I managed to score these samples, so thank you Sam from Archie Rose. So the Dry Grown Rye Malt Whisky Harvest 2019 is a bit different. Although the grain was grown in drought conditions with no irrigation, similar to the last one, but this time it came from various farms, bringing together multiple drought-resistant grains like barley and heirloom rye, and even ancient purple and black malt. It was also allowed to wild ferment before malting. Now, pitching these two together is actually a little bit of an unfair fight. So the 2019 that was just released is 48% ABV and it sells for $149. Meanwhile, the 2018 release is cask strength at 61.6% and it sells for $249.
I must break you.
Meh. We'll see how they go. So, as you can see, there's not much of a difference in the colour between these two. They've got a very beautiful, rich brown colour, very typical of rye whiskey. There's one thing I'm going to show, because this is the 2019 and this is the 2018. So this one's cask strength and this one's not. And there's actually like a little bit of a test that you can see for how high the ABV is. If I shake this up, you see how slowly the bubbles are dissipating? They're still lingering around. If I do the same thing with the cask strength, those bubbles have dissipated really, really quickly. And it's because the water allows those bubbles to remain, but the higher alcohol volume in the cask strength, it doesn't allow those air bubbles to remain. So sometimes when you're working in a distillery and you've got bottles of whiskey and you want to basically check what the ABV is, you might just give the bottle a quick shake and just see how quickly those bubbles disappear. So I'm going to start with the 2019 so I don't blow out my senses. I really like the nose of this one. You get quite a bit of candied orange. It's real toffee candied sort of aromas. almost a little bit of apricot candy, but just a lot of scents that are very caramelized. Meanwhile, in the 2018 cask strength, a lot more of those rye spices are coming across. So things like baking spices, it's kind of nutmeg, it's kind of cinnamon, not quite cinnamon. And there's almost like a little bit of baked pear. But it's interesting, this is a lot more grain forward on the nose, whereas the other one's a lot more candied. But to taste, so not as much of those candied aromas from the nose come across on the palate. There is that sweetness there, but on the palate is where a lot of that rye comes in. It kind of almost actually does taste like you've spread marmalade over a piece of rye toast. And then that sweetness sort of hits with a little bit of a sharpness at the back of the palate. And that's kind of what lingers. It's almost sort of like a slightly watered down butterscotch at the back of the throat. And for the weaker of the two, it actually does stick around reasonably long on the back of the palate. I do love the way a cask strength whiskey, just the warmth that hits your mouth and then flows right through is beautiful. On the palate with this one, it's funny, that poached pear sort of that's on the nose, that carries across a little bit on the palate, but not much. You sort of get this oiliness that sort of, it's almost like dark chocolate, and you don't get as much of that spice. It's like a malty chocolate, it really is. And then that burn, that warmth that works its way from the back of your throat all the way down your chest. Now that I'm sitting on this a bit, I am starting to get some of those rye spices. They're sitting around on the back of the palate. They're opening up more as this sits there in the glass. So this is changing over time. Whereas I think even if I go back to the 2019, it's not really developing anymore. It's stopped what it was doing. So I wouldn't really say that's a surprise. We all know I've got a bit of a penchant for the cask strength whiskies. The higher ABV, it usually does just carry more of those natural oils, which does help to carry more flavor across. It coats the mouth more and it just lingers a lot more on the palate. And because it hasn't had water added, it's allowed to develop more in the glass. So yes, the cask strength whiskey is the better one out of the two. But, and I don't like adding water too much, I'm going to add some water to this just to try and put these two on similar ABVs and see if they're equal whiskies if they're in a fair fight. I'm not doing too much math here, 61 down to 48, I'm just sort of giving it a good squirt, maybe a teeny bit more, just because we want this similar to 48%. So where I can use my little test. There we go, those bubbles are dissipating slowly. It hurts because this was such a nice whiskey. There we go. I think that's a bit better. So these should be about the same ABV now. So that bit of water, it's lightened that sweetness on the nose. So there's not as much of the rye spice coming across now, but that sort of poached pear has now turned into a little bit more like, not quite fresh fruits, but definitely not poached, but not candied like the 2019. Softening that out has let out a little bit more of like a butter texture, which I'm really surprised at that. I thought adding water wouldn't give it more texture, but it's also allowing like this really nice soft caramel to come across. There are still some spices in there, not quite as strong as you would often expect from a rye whiskey. And there's still a faint little bit of dark chocolate, but it's sort of carried a little bit more across with the sort of cinnamon that you would get in an apple pie. That's still a really nice whiskey. Okay, so in comparing these two, If you are somebody who likes cask strength whiskey and you're willing to spend the money, I would say that the 2018 at $250 is the better option. But that's not to say that the 2019 isn't a bad whiskey, it's still wonderful. But if you watered down that 2018, let's just say if Archie Rose was to release both of these at 48% at the same price, I actually think I would struggle to decide which one I wanted to buy. I'm actually really surprised at that. I wasn't expecting that turnaround. I thought having tried the cask strength and then watering it down was going to just damage the impression for me. But they're both just as good whiskies as each other. They just chose to release one at cask strength and one at 48%. Get what you want to get. If you don't like cask strength, grab the 2018 and water it down and you've got yourself probably a bottle and a half. One of the things I find really unusual about Archie Rose Distillery is my personal preference is for single malt whiskey. I usually prefer that over rye, but when it comes to Archie Rose, I actually prefer their rye whiskies. It's not that there's anything really wrong with their single malts, they're still enjoyable, you can still drink them, but my personal impression of them is that they could spend just a little bit more time in the barrel. Whereas the rye whiskies, they're just ready. If anybody else has got the same impression of Archie Rose Distillery, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Do you prefer their single malts or do you prefer their ryes? Because for me, it's every single time I come back to them, it's one or the other. But that's all for me this week. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. If you want to see more from me, consider subscribing. And until next time, enjoy what's in your glass and slange.